Now your host for the Middle East Radio Forum, attorney William J. Wolf.
Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. It's December 24, 2017, 1 o'clock here in Phoenix Mountain Time. Yes, today is going to be Devin Sper. Devin Sper, how you doing?
Good.
You've been on the show before. You're an author and a speaker. You're born and raised in New York. You've lived in Israel for 10 years. You have a degree in Jewish history from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and served in the Israeli Defense Forces. Since returning to the United States in 1982, you have spoken to numerous live radio and television audiences in defense of Israel. Devin Sper is the author of a blog on the Times of Israel and the book The Future of Israel, winner of the 2005 Glip Award. And I think we should give away some of your books to our callers today. How about that?
That's a nice idea.
Okay, everybody who calls in with a good question will get a copy of Devin's book, and I'll make the arrangement. You can pick it up next Sunday. Okay, Devin, let's talk about Donald Trump changes the dynamic of Middle East diplomacy. Is President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital and his intention to move the embassy there significant, or does he feel it's just words that he's using?
I think it is significant. You know that every presidential candidate has promised to do that, and it was not significant because they're candidates and they're pandering for votes. But the difference is that President Trump has said this as president, and that's a different story. It has the authority of law, and he intends to do this. So I think it's, first of all, real. Secondly, what it makes clear is that the United States values Israel and her relationship with Israel and is no longer going to allow the Palestinian issue to hold that relationship hostage. So, you know, the president may be interested in peace between Israel and the Palestinians if that's possible, but he's making clear that his relationship with Israel and his value of and the way he sees and values Israel is as an ally that stands independent of the Palestinians who may or may not be able to ever be pleased.
Okay, we have talked about this before in recent weeks because it's just so apparent. Maybe it's not so apparent, but they're talking about moving it to West Jerusalem, and that was part of Israel from the beginning. This is not in the territory that was captured in 1967. So what is the argument against that being Israel's capital and the argument against any country having their embassy where Israel designates its capital to be, just like every other country can designate their capital?
Well, the answer to that is that they don't really accept the existence of Israel as a Jewish state in the middle of the Middle East, and therefore they don't accept her capital. And Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital is a step, as far as they're concerned, in the wrong direction. They're trying to delegitimize Israel in their effort to destroy her, and this legitimizes Israel and legitimizes her capital. So anything that goes in the direction of legitimizing Israel, they oppose, because they're opposed to the existence of Israel in any borders with any capital.
And as the UN vote that was recently taken clearly shows, basically the world hates Israel.
I wouldn't say that. I would look at the 65 countries that didn't vote for it. Some of them abstained, 35 abstained, 21 didn't show up, and 9 voted again. So the 35 and the 21, maybe they didn't have the guts to stand up in the face of Arab terror, but they didn't vote for it. And so there are now 65 countries who are basically agree to it.
Okay, diplomats throughout the world, along with those of our own State Department, lobbied heavily against Trump's decision, as did his own secretaries of state and defense and head of the CIA. Was Trump right to ignore the advice of so many of these foreign policy experts?
You know, if we look at the track record of these foreign policy experts over the last 50, 60, 70 years of Middle East diplomacy, we see that they've achieved nothing. And they've achieved nothing because their premises are wrong. Their premise is that this is a border dispute, that the problem is Israel, that the problem has something to do with where Israel's borders are located, when in fact that's not the problem. The problem is that, as we just said, the enemies of Israel, led by the Palestinians in particular, don't accept the idea of a Jewish state in the Middle East altogether. And so based on false premises, even intelligent people can build houses of cards, and that's what these diplomats have done. They've had negotiations at Camp David, going back as far as you want to go, all of which have failed, and the Middle East is no better off, in fact, is worse off than it's ever been. So Trump began his speech talking about this. He paraphrased Einstein, and he said, I'll quote, "It would be folly to assume that repeating the same exact formula would now produce a different or better result." And so should he be listening to these people who have failed utterly for 70 years to achieve anything except instability in the Middle East? The answer is no. He needs to try a different tact, and that's exactly what he's doing.
You know, Devin, it seems like this continuing talk of a peace process, it just drives me crazy for how many decades they've been talking about it. There is no peace process. There never has been, and there cannot be one with people who only want you and your family dead. What is it they don't get about this? How can they not understand that there never has and cannot be a peace process? This is not about land. This is about the ideology of Islam, basically, that is totally incompatible with Israel existing.
I think the entire peace process is a fake peace process in which the world seeks to buy off Arab terror by paying in Israeli coin and with the blood of the Israeli people. And so it's very easy for the French or the Germans or us under the Obama administration to say, yes, give them something to keep them quiet. But the dynamic was that when Israel gave them something and they rioted and murdered and committed terror, they were told, give them something more. If Israel didn't give them something, they said, well, they're rioting because of that. Now that entire dynamic, because of Trump's move, has been reversed. And now the Palestinians are on the outside looking in, because if they do nothing, Israel's doing very well, and they're not doing too well. So the status quo favors Israel. They need the United States to pressure Israel into giving them anything, because they're not going to defeat her in war. And so they're now boycotting the United States. Abbas said he won't meet with Pence. So if they boycott the United States, that's their loss. It's a lose-lose situation for them and a win-win situation for Israel. So what Trump did is he absolutely changed the entire dynamic of Middle East diplomacy, and it's now much more favorable to Israel.
You know, what's fascinating is a lot of fascinating things, but like when Haiti had the earthquake, Israel sent in probably the most advanced surgical people that came to Haiti, and they've given a lot of aid to national disasters everywhere. I understand they tried to do it with Bangladesh, but they turned them down. You can imagine that, turning down these life-saving measures because they happen to be Jews.
They actually offered the same to Iran, who, of course, turned them down as well.
And they also have a field hospital in the Golan that they've been treating Syrians, and they actually established a gynecological...
In Syria.
Yeah, in Syria.
Yeah, in Syria itself.
Isn't that amazing? I mean, what other country does that? Yet, of course, the world's going to hate Israel because Israel's standing on its own two feet, and they don't have all the oil that the Arabs have.
I don't think the world hates Israel. I think that the world is afraid of the oil and the Arabs and terror, and they kowtow to it. That's not the same as them hating Israel. I think even in Europe, average people don't hate Israel. I think quite the contrary. They admire Israel. But their governments and their elites are in bed with the oil money and with those who oppose Israel, and they pay lip service to it.
You know, it's interesting. I was just at the doctor, and I got some prescriptions. And you know where the medication was made? It was made in Israel by Teva. And I've never seen any medication from any Arab country. I've never seen any medical advance from any Arab country.
Look, I travel all around the world on business. I'm in Asia every year. Never have I heard any disparaging remarks about Israel or the Jews. On the contrary, they have great admiration for the Jewish people, for their work ethic, for the ancient culture, for their connection to their land, for their family orientation. And I find even in Europe, among working class people, among average people, they get it. They understand. They are being terrorized by exactly the same people as Israel is being terrorized, and they identify with her. But their elites are another story.
I'm just wondering what's going to happen in Europe with the tremendous influx of Muslims who have absolutely no interest in assimilating. Their interest is in staying separate and basically taking over through the population explosion.
Well, the question is whether the average European will overthrow the elites. And they may have been so brainwashed that they are not capable of doing that. So the right in Israel, in Europe has risen in every country, but they have not taken power. And you would think by this time people would be done with Merkel and the government in France and in England, and yet they're not. So they may not have the backbone to do anything about it. I think the United States is different.
You know, what's interesting is every individual Palestinian I have ever met has been a warm, wonderful person. And it just doesn't compute with the fact that they have elected these people in Gaza and in what they call the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, who have this horrible attitude about destroying Israel and killing all the Jews. It doesn't compute. The average Palestinian, at least that I've met, has been a wonderful person.
Well, let me just say the ones you've met are here, and they may be here for a reason. They may be here because they don't want part of all that. But Hamas was elected democratically by the majority there. They've been brainwashed for years by terrorist organization that has run their school system and their newspapers and allows no other opinion. And children walk around with the keychains of the martyrs. And if someone kills themselves, they are a hero and get a military parade. So I think the ones that you find here are a little bit more willing to look outside the box.
Okay, and we're coming up on the first break of today's show. You're listening to Middle East Radio Forum here on 960 The Patriot. Please stay with us. We're right back with my wonderful guest here, Devin Sper.
Now back to your host, Attorney William J. Wolf.
Welcome back to today's very interesting edition of Middle East Radio Forum. I think they're all interesting, but Devin Sper hasn't been on for a while, and he's a tremendous guest. I know we have a call from Jan in Sun City. We'll get to her in just a minute, but Devin, go ahead and finish your thoughts from before the last break.
Well, you had asked about, we talked about why the experts have all been wrong in the past, and I want to also talk about their premise that the Palestinian issue is the crux and the reason for Middle East instability. And I think it's just become apparent, if you look at what's going on in the Middle East, that that isn't the case. When you look at ISIS and what they've been doing, when you look at 9/11, when you look at the civil wars in Iraq, Yemen, and Syria and the destruction, none of these things have anything to do with Israel and the Palestinian issue. And therefore, this mantra that the Palestinian issue is the key to peace in the Middle East is obvious nonsense. And that's just so apparent that it's hard for them to make that case anymore. Saddam didn't conquer Kuwait because of the Palestinian issue. Iran isn't taking over Yemen and Syria and Lebanon because of the Palestinian issue. This is the way the Middle East has operated for 1,300 years, and I think it has to be crystal clear to anyone with open eyes.
Or with a half a brain.
Yeah.
Okay, fair enough. Jan from Sun City, thanks for holding. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Devin Sper about the timetable for the move of the embassy. Is it going to be something that happens when Trump is still in office, or is it after he leaves? And what's the implication of that?
That's a really good question. I don't have any information about it other than speculation I've read. I read that it took them 8 years to move the embassy in London, but I think you've brought up a very good point that I hadn't really thought of, which is that if it extends beyond the time that Trump is president, it probably will never happen. Nevertheless, I think that his declaration of recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital is in and of itself very important. And if they start to build the embassy, buy a piece of land, and at least get going in that direction, then perhaps it'll happen.
Okay, thanks for that question, Jan. There will be a book, Devin's book, waiting for you next Sunday here at the studio, and you can pick up anytime next week.
Thank you.
All right, thanks for your call. Okay, Devin, let's get back to my questions. Devin, doesn't President Trump's recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital undermine the diplomatic position of the United States as a trusted, neutral negotiator between Israeli and the Palestinians?
I take issue with the whole idea that the United States should be neutral between Israel and the Palestinians. You know, Martin Luther King once said, speaking about civil rights, that there is a right side and a wrong side in this conflict, and the government of the United States doesn't belong in the middle. And I would say the same thing about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. There is a right side and there is a wrong side in this conflict. and the United States doesn't belong in the middle. The United States belongs on the side of Israel, its long-standing ally, which is the only reliable, stable democracy in the region. Why should it give equal billing to the Palestinian Authority, which is composed of the Hamas terrorist organization and the PLO terrorist organization, which was formerly pro-Soviet, which have murdered Americans in numerous terrorist incidents? So the whole idea that the United States should be neutral between its friend and his enemy makes no sense to me. And what Trump's statement is really telling the Palestinians is that from here on out, they're going to pay a price if they continue to deny the reality of Israel and refuse to compromise. They've now lost Jerusalem, in essence, and they know this. And it seems very likely to me and very possible that President Trump is exactly the man who might just abandon the fiction of Palestine altogether. Just as he abandoned the fiction that Jerusalem is not Israel's capital, if they continue down this road of boycotting negotiations and not accepting the right of Israel to exist, he might just say that, you know what, the whole Palestinian issue is a fiction, which it is. He may say the emperor has new clothes, and that would be the end of that.
Okay, very good. Let's go to another caller. Frank from Phoenix. Go ahead, you're on the air.
A couple of weeks ago, I learned that the United States has a military base in the Negev desert near Dimona. I was wondering what information Devin can provide about the size, the number of troops, the amount of equipment that's over there, and things like that about that military base.
Frank, I have no information on that, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to be in Israel tomorrow and for a couple of weeks, and I'm going to ask around. And if it's not a state secret, maybe I'll be able to learn that, and I'll let Bill know what the answer is. And
I appreciate that. Of course, Dimona is where Israel's atomic reactor is located, so I'm sure it's very, very well defended. All right, Frank, you'll have a book waiting for you starting a week from today. How's that?
Well, if I have to come pick it up, I have to decline.
Okay, well, that's your choice, certainly, but that's the only way we can get it to you. Okay, thanks for your call, Frank. All right, Devin, let's continue. Why do the Palestinians and their allies object so vehemently to recognizing the reality of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, which, after all, is and has been since the establishment of the State of Israel?
They object to recognizing the capital of Israel because they object to recognizing Israel. Recognizing the capital of the Jewish state means there is a Jewish state. And they wouldn't recognize any capital of Israel, just as they don't recognize any borders of Israel. Look, they not only deny that Israel exists, on their maps it doesn't appear. In their meter they call it the Zionist entity. They refuse to acknowledge its representatives in public when they see them at the UN or somewhere else. But they not only deny that the current state of Israel exists, they deny 3,000 years of Jewish history in the land of Israel. They deny that that the Jewish temple ever stood on the Temple Mount, even though it's referenced extensively in the Bible, in the New Testament, and in the Quran. But they deny this. Yasser Arafat was standing in front of President Clinton at Camp David, and he said, no temple ever stood at the Temple Mount. This is a lie. And President Clinton, who had believed him up to that point, realized that he is absolutely incredulous.
Well, Devin, excuse me, this goes back to what we were saying for almost 15 years here on Middle East Radio Forum. There cannot be and never has been a peace process. Where does this peace process idea even come from? This is so absurd.
Well, there's never been a peace process. What there's been is Israel should give away some of her land to appease the Palestinians and their allies process, because there's never been any peace in return. From the beginning, 3 months after Israel went down this road of the Palestinian peace process, there was the first suicide bombing. 3 months later. And they've continued ever since, and 10,000 Israelis have been killed in that time since then. So if that first one and that second one and that third one wasn't enough, you would think people at one point would wake up. But people believe what they choose to believe, what's convenient for them to believe. And so, there's a whole diplomatic industry. There's a whole bunch of European and American and other diplomats who go to nice hotels around the world. It's like a movable feast, and they're feted and they can feel they're doing something important, and it all revolves around this fake peace process, while the Israeli people sleep in bomb shelters and have to have missiles raining down on them and have to worry about terrorism. And so this is all at their expense, and it's time that we ended the charade.
Okay, I think we're coming up upon the next break. You're listening to Middle East Radio Forum here on 960 The Patriot. Welcome back to today's edition of Middle East Radio Forum. My name is William Wolf. My guest in studio today is Devin Sper. And again, anybody who calls will get a free book. And Devin told me that, Frank, he will send it to you by mail. So if you're one of the people who've called in and you want it mailed to you instead of coming to the station, he will do that. But send me an email, radioforum@aol.com. Give me your address, and I'll forward it on to Devin.
The same for Jan from Sun City.
Right. Next question, Devin. Even if it is true that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, how does United States recognition of that fact move the peace process forward? And again, I hate to use that phrase peace process because, in my opinion, there never has been, never can be. But you can handle that any way you like.
Well, I think it's important to say that because this is the kind of thing you hear in the media. This is the kind of thing you hear in CNN. I heard Jake Tapper say that the other day. How does this move the peace process forward? And Nikki Haley, who he was speaking to and who was very good, didn't really have an answer for it. So I'd like to answer that question. First of all, let me be clear so the listeners understand that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. That is where the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, sits. All the major government offices are there, the Supreme Court, the president and the prime minister's offices and residence. So that's just recognizing reality in the first place. Jerusalem has had a Jewish majority for well over a century, and it's been the capital of the state of Israel since her foundation 70 years ago. And it is the heart and the spiritual center of the Jewish people since Jerusalem was founded by King David 3,000 years ago. So first of all, recognizing the truth is never in the way of peace. And you can't build peace on lies, as they've been trying to do until now. So the first step, in every 12-step program, the first thing you have to do is admit the problem. And until the Palestinians admit that Israel is real and that Jerusalem is its capital and it's a Jewish state, how are you going to talk about where the borders go? And how are you going to talk about all these little modalities of peace if they don't accept the existence of the state in the first place? So it moves the peace process forward because you start with the truth and not with a lie. Now, if the United States does not recognize Israel's capital, as it did not until Donald Trump, how are you going to ask the Palestinians to do that? How can you ask that of the rest of the world when we haven't done that? So the very first step in peace, if there's ever to be a peace, is that the United States has to recognize the reality of Israel and Jerusalem as its capital. Then she has to demand that others do likewise. And then you can talk about the modalities of where the border goes. You have to start from that. That's why this is so important and so critical. Now, for over a century, the Palestinians have not recognized Israel and have taken a maximalist position, which is they want to roll back history to a time when the modern state of Israel didn't exist. And catering to their fantasies of eliminating Israel hasn't achieved anything. And if there's going to be any sort of agreement, it has to be based on the objective reality.
Okay, Devin, there have been some violent reaction to Trump's decision. Quite frankly, I think it's less than I was expecting, at least. But I talked to my brother back in Illinois, and he is, shall we say, to the left of this program. And he was...
I think most people are to the left of this.
Well, in any event, he was talking about how can you do that when there will be the violent reaction. So my response is what? We should yield to mob rule. The mob determines what Israel can and cannot do?
I find this almost comical, and I've heard that also about the violent reaction. Hamas threatened that there'll be violence if he recognizes Jerusalem, as if up till now they've been a bunch of choir boys, and Turkey and Iran are predicting chaos in the Middle East, as if up until now there hasn't been chaos in the Middle East, and it's prime motivators, so it's prime instigators. So I think it's funny, and it's kind of like the boy who cried wolf. If they could have destroyed Israel yesterday before the announcement, would they have done that? Of course they would. So what's changed? Were they throwing rocks yesterday and rioting yesterday? Yes, they were. So what's changed? In other words, it's like the boy who cried wolf. You do what you have to do because it doesn't matter. They don't accept Israel's existence altogether. And therefore, since their position is so unrealistic and so intransigent, there's no point trying to appease it. If they were more reasonable, they might get something on the other end from Israel. But since they don't accept Israel at all, there's nothing here to appease. Since they're violent all the time, there's no point trying to mitigate the violence.
Okay, it's just fascinating that my brother happened to get married in Israel. He lived there for about 10 years, had 3 daughters born in Israel, and I don't understand how he can come up with these opinions. And I always mention the lesson of Gaza. Why is the lesson of Gaza not very, very relevant? They turned over land to the Palestinians. They removed all the Jews forcibly. They even left some high-tech greenhouses there to jumpstart the economy in Gaza. And what did they do? They destroyed the greenhouses. They have absolutely no interest in developing an economy. They just wanted to use it as a terror base to attack Israel. It's just absolutely amazing. And I'll give you about 30 seconds, then we have to go to break. I know we have a call from Joe. We'll get to Joe's question after the break. Go ahead, Devin.
I just want to say that people like your brother cannot be entirely faulted because that's all they hear from the mainstream media over and over. And that's the importance of your show. It doesn't take a lot for people to recognize the truth. But if they never hear the truth, then they simply repeat the thing that they've heard because they've never heard another point of view. As soon as you point out the truth, your brother and everyone else gets it. As soon as you point out that it's ridiculous for them to be threatening violence when they've been violent for the last 70 years, everyone can see that that's reality.
Okay. We'll get to Joe's question after the break. You're listening to Middle East Radio Forum here on 960 The Patriot. Welcome to the final segment of today's Middle East Radio Forum. My name is William Wolf. My guest is Devin Sper. Thanks for listening, and thanks for spreading the word about this show. Let's go to our caller, Joe from Phoenix. Go ahead. You're on the air.
Yeah, hi. Well, obviously there's never been peace, and personally I've never really been sure what a peace process is. But moments ago in the show you said there really isn't one, and I was talking to a friend about this. Many times that we've talked about this, and often he's brought up that, well, Benjamin Netanyahu even says that he's committed to the peace process and the two-state solution. And, I responded to him that I had the theory or the idea that maybe he's saying this just for appearances. And I wonder what your guest would think about that, or why does he think Benjamin Netanyahu is validating it seemingly in such a way?
Joe, that's an excellent, excellent question, and one of the hardest questions I've ever been asked to answer because, unfortunately, I don't think that Netanyahu, honestly, ever believed in it. I don't think most people on the right in Israel ever believed in it. I think the left did for a while, and they don't anymore. But it's sort of they have to go along with it because otherwise the United States and everyone else said that they're standing in the way of peace. And so they had to at least make the effort to show that they're not the problem, and then it would become clear that the Palestinians were the problem. Now, in the past, that didn't buy them anything because everyone still said they're the problem. No matter what they did. They gave away land. The Palestinians sent over suicide bombers. It was still them. They didn't give enough land. And I don't believe he's an intelligent person, Netanyahu, and I don't believe he ever believed in this. There was an incident some years ago where he was on a radio show, and in a hot mic, he said this openly, and it was caught on the air, and that this is all a bunch of nonsense. And I think now that Trump is president and clearly sees things clearly, I don't think they're going to go along with this pretense the way they did in the past. The only ones that Netanyahu and other Israeli politicians were seeking to mollify was the United States. They don't care what Abbas thinks. They don't care what Iraq thinks or Iran thinks. They don't care what the Europeans think, who are in bed with the Hamas and Iran. But they did very much care what the United States thought, and they wanted to stay on the United States' good graces. And the United States never believed in it, but it was a way to buy off to pretend there's some sort of progress so they could continue their relations with the Sunni Arabs and do business as usual. Oil gets bought, oil gets sold, stuff comes, stuff goes, they sell them weapons, and they're giving, really, the United States and the other countries were giving face to the Sunni Arabs by going along with this fake peace process, because they've so brainwashed their own people about Palestine that they have to do that. Now they've sort of painted themselves into a corner, the Sunni Arabs, because they themselves know it's all fake, and they need the United States to protect, and Israel, to protect them against Iran. And the United States isn't going along with the game anymore, so they're in a bit of a bind. And I think the entire dynamic is now shifting, and you may see going forward that Netanyahu will not maintain this charade anymore. But that's my explanation of why he did it in the past. I don't think he ever believed in it.
Okay, Joe, thanks for that question. Again, send us your address by email, radioforum@AOL.com. We'll get you a copy of that book. Let's go to another caller. Joel from Phoenix, you're on the air.
You know what saddens me about our colleges and our students in colleges is they march around and protest with their Palestinian friends. The idea is they want to have a state for them. But these people are the same people that want every single man, woman, and child in Israel to be slaughtered. What kind of students do we got? What kind of people are these marching around with the Palestinians? Thank you.
I couldn't agree with you more, Joel. I think it's absolutely outrageous that what is essentially a genocidal movement, the Palestinians preach genocide openly against Israel, because that's what it means when you're going to say we're going to destroy Israel. There are 8.5 million people in Israel, and they openly preach its destruction. And this is a cause celeb on our campuses. It's completely outrageous. If it was any other group or any other people, no one would accept it. But because it's the Jews, it's an anti-Semitic double standard, and it's nothing more than that. It allows the anti-Semites to march around and preach what they've always preached, which is kill the Jews, but feel that they can do it with some cloak of morality. And the same goes for Europe and the inherent anti-Semitism and the millennium-old anti-Semitism in Europe. And now the anti-Semites, where it was taboo after World War II to be an anti-Semite, now they can say that they're anti-Israel when it amounts to exactly the same thing. I think it's the most outrageous thing.
And, of course, Europe has kind of made its own bed with all of this immigration from the Arab lands, the Muslim lands, and they're going to pay the penalty down the road.
Well, because there is a God, and they'll pay the price in the end.
Okay, another question. Considering all the opposition to his decision that has stirred up in the overwhelming vote in the United Nations last week, condemning it, did President Trump do the right thing? You and I, of course, agree that he did, but go ahead and explain it to the audience.
Okay, because, again, this is the sort of question that comes up in the press. You know, maybe it's true that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, they'll say. Maybe it's true that there hasn't been any progress in peace until now. But, you know, doesn't this just make the matters worse? So first of all, I go back to what I said, that you can't build peace on lies. Secondly, from a moral point of view, not recognizing Jerusalem's capital is an anti-Semitic double standard, because every nation in the world is allowed to choose its own capital except the Jewish state, and that's not acceptable to us. So Israel will choose its own capital, and the United States will put its embassy wherever she wants to put it. And the United Nations does not tell the United States where we can put our embassies, and does not tell Israel where her capital city is, just as she doesn't tell anyone else where their capital city is. So the president's declaration recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel rights this wrong and puts the United States on the side of morality and away from this anti-Semitic double standard that much of the world still beholds. I want to give President Trump a lot of credit for that. His own State Department, his Secretary of State, his Secretary of Defense Mathis, the head of the CIA Pompeo, all lobbied against him doing this. I don't have to tell you that the Arabs lobbied against it, the Russians, the Europeans all lobbied against it. And he stood up and he did the right thing. And there's a saying in the Talmud, in a place where there's no men, there strive to be a man. And Donald Trump has stood up against the mob and against conventional wisdom and against all the experts, and he has done the right thing. And that takes heart, and that takes courage. It takes no courage to go and chant the same thing the mob is chanting. He has done a moral thing. He has done a practical thing, because I said the first step to real peace is to acknowledge the truth, and I think he gets a lot of credit for doing this.
Devin, are you saying this is an improvement over the Obama administration? I'm trying to read between the lines here.
I'm not trying to be too partisan, so I didn't mention Obama, but I want to tell you I give a lot of credit to Donald Trump for doing this, even if you disagree with what he did. You have to admit that he stood up against all the advice, and the only reason he did it is he felt it was the right thing. There's no question here. Israel doesn't have the oil. Israel doesn't have the money that the Saudis have in U.S. banks. Israel doesn't have the friends all over the world. So the bread is buttered on the other side, and yet he stood up and he called Jerusalem what it is, the capital of Israel, and despite their threats, and he stood up to it, and I think he gets credit for that. That is a sign of a man who has the courage of his convictions, and something we don't see a lot in politics at all.
Okay, I have a little email here from Sharon in Mesa. Wonderful guest today, but she has a criticism. She says, way too much common sense.
I was just going to say I'm open to criticism, but thank you so much.
That's not criticism. Sharon, thank you very much for the email. And if you'd like a book, send us your mailing address. We don't have another call, so let me ask you this. Beyond the recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital, what further thing should Trump do? Obviously, he should move the embassy physically to Jerusalem, but what about the funds to these hostiles, these countries that are sucking at the breast, basically, of the United States, getting all this money, and that he keeps stabbing the United States in the back?
Well, I love what Nikki Haley and Donald Trump said about that. Nikki Haley got to the UN and said, okay, you vote how you want, but we're taking names. And Donald Trump added to that, and we're going to cut off aid to those who vote against us, because they're voting against the United States. They're insulting the United States by saying that it is illegal. They like to use the term illegal. You know, they put bombs in a supermarket. That's not illegal. Right? They go into a nursery school and gun down children. That's somehow not illegal. But it's somehow illegal for the United States to put its embassy wherever she wants to put it.
Devin, that's too much common sense. That's what the criticism was.
So I think he should follow through with that. Now, a lot of people say he won't because we need these allies. I think he needs to teach them a lesson. I think it's absurd that people will spit in the face of the United States and we send them money. And it also says in the Talmud, if I'm not for myself, who will be? So if the United States doesn't stand up for her honor in this case, who will? And he definitely needs to cut off the funds to all these countries that we don't need but need us. And when they come running for our protection and our soldiers to die for them, as we died in Europe for the fight of the Europeans in Bosnia and in Serbia, it was American soldiers had to go over there. When it's always Americans who have to do the fighting and the heavy lifting for them. And I think it's time that we called them on this, and we made them at least stop spitting in our face.
You know, Devin, we've said this before on Middle East Radio Forum. The so-called occupation of Israel of what they call the West Bank, it was captured in a defensive war, and under international law, you don't give it back so they can try it again. You get to keep it unless there's some type of a negotiated agreement. But there's never any talk about, for instance, I think China's really occupied Tibet since about 1950. You have Turkey that's occupied half of Cyprus. You have Morocco that's occupied South Sahara. And there's many and many other real occupations, but it never gets mentioned just against Israel. It's got to be nothing more or less than anti-Semitism.
I take issue with it even being occupation, because occupation is if one country takes land from another country. But
that was my point. It was captured in a defensive war.
No, not only that. Not only was that, but there was the status of that area before that was at the best, you could say, disputed. In other words, in the United Nations in 1948, divided Israel between the Jews and the Arabs, but the Arabs rejected that resolution, and therefore they cannot come 70 years after the fact and saying, you occupied our territory, when they rejected the division of territory in the first place, launched a genocidal war against Israel the next day, and lost. It's like the Germans who, after they lost World War II, having occupied the whole of Europe, you have to give them credit. At least they knew what they had done, and they tried to make amends such as possible, and more importantly, they admitted their guilt. The enemies of Israel, on the other hand, claim to be the victim, and that's their trick. They're trying to wipe Israel off the map, and they're the victim somehow of the very people whom they're trying to wipe out. I would say even if it was occupied, when someone is trying to murder you, when someone is trying to commit genocide against you, you don't owe them anything. You don't owe them any nice legalities. You're free to occupy them. You're free to do whatever you want to them, because when you go out to commit genocide against someone else, you don't really have the right to complain afterwards when they come back and get you, the way the Russians went into Germany and the way the Allies went into Germany. They knew what they did. They went out to conquer the world. They murdered 40 million people, and they shut their mouth when it was over because they knew they were guilty for starting it. The Japanese didn't complain that America was unjust in occupying Japan because they started the war and they knew that that was the consequence of their own actions. The Arabs don't take responsibility for their own actions.
The world doesn't make them take responsibility. That's the problem.
That's right. That's right. And it's not in their culture to take responsibility. It's always someone doing something to them, which is why they can't progress, because it's never their fault and they never take responsibility for themselves.
Okay, Devin, I can give you one more minute to sum up, then we're at the end of the show.
Well, all I can say is that I, again, want to give a lot of credit to Donald Trump for doing this. Contrary to what you may hear, I think it's very significant. I think words on their own have meaning. And the enemy has tried to delegitimize Israel with the ultimate goal of annihilating her. You know, you demonize someone whom you wish to kill. As Netanyahu once said, slander is the prelude to murder. And the antidote to that, therefore, is to legitimize Israel so that they cannot get away with the genocidal scheme that they plan. And this is a brave move by Donald Trump and a smart move.
Okay, Devin Sper, thank you very much. A terrific guest. And as Jan said, she'd like to have you on again, and I certainly will have you on again. You write articles that are very, very interesting, very well thought out, and I think especially after you have an article published, we should have you back on the show.
And anyone can look up my articles, look up my name, Devin Sper, Sper, and look up Times of Israel. And I have my own blog on Times of Israel, and I also have my own website, which you can find at WordPress, devinspear.wordpress.com. And you can read all my articles and see my interviews on there.
Okay, Devin, again, thank you very much. A terrific show.
Always
terrific
a pleasure.
Presentation, and I will have you on again for sure. I'd like to thank you for listening to Middle East Radio Forum.